Hello, everybody. I'm Aaron Simmons, and this is Two Philosophers, One Conversation, where we try to remind ourselves and you that philosophy has always been about the public good, where we do our best to make meaning in light of the fact that we are mortal beings. So I am joined today with a very special guest, Todd May, a professor of philosophy at Clemson University, a widely prolific author, has written numerous books, both for specialists and also for broader audiences. He's been the philosophical consultant for NBC's The Good Place. Many of you who saw the last episode may recognize him from that one. And I'm excited to have Todd with us today because the books that he's been writing, with titles such as Death, A Fragile Life, A Significant Life, A Decent Life, these are the kinds of books that speak to, I think, where we find ourselves today, because he's been trying for years to think about how to live the good life and to do it with others, rather than simply thinking that the task of philosophy is only to navigate technical questions that are somehow not applicable to where we find ourselves. So Todd, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks, Aaron. And look, it's great to be here. And also, I really appreciate the work that you're doing, right, to get this stuff in the public realm, particularly in a time when people can't go out, right, and actually be together.
Maybe we can start off, Todd, simply by talking about your own transition to this public space. How is it that you started thinking more and being more intentional about writing and speaking and engaging with a very public audience rather than just writing for philosophers?
Well, I think when we start our careers, and I'm going to ask, I'll ask you back when I'm done with this, how it feels for you. But when we start our careers, we want to make it within the parameters of the career, right? What are the rules that they've set out for us? But at some point, I thought, okay, I've done that. I've done what it is that I need to do, and I had never really set out to do philosophy in order to do narrow philosophy that could only be read by other philosophers. So I started to reflect and ask myself, well, what would I want to write, right? And in thinking about that, right, I was thinking about the writing something for my kids, right, that would be something that they could understand. And that's where the Death book came from, right? I didn't want my kids, right, to grow up and then people ask them, look, your dad was a philosopher, what did you learn about life? And they said nothing. All I learned was that he writes for people, like 20 different people, right? And so that's where the Death book came from. And then I just sort of started moving and thinking, well, look, this is something that is more important than the stuff I was doing, right, in technical philosophy. I've got background in technical philosophy, so why don't I see if I can take some of the ideas that are floating around and are important ideas and make them accessible for people, right, in a wider range. I'm tossing it back to you, Aaron, because you're also, right, more interested in public philosophy. I don't know if it affects your writing, but it certainly is something that you've been trying to do over the years.
It's true. I remember several years ago, you and I were sitting at dinner, and you told me that, once you had dipped your toe in this water, it was hard to get back out of it because you found it much more compelling. And I guess the same is true for me. When I was at grad school at Vanderbilt, I was working on, very technical work in continental philosophy, writing a dissertation. And even in the process of doing that, though, I remember being told by some of my dissertation advisors that the clarity with which I wrote was something that they found very compelling. And so I thought, well, shoot, why would I ever want to write about very difficult things in a difficult manner? I should write about difficult things in a way that hopefully invites people to understand them more effectively. And so for me, even when I've done very technical continental philosophy, the goal has always been to expand the audience, I guess is the way to put it. And so that's why I've done a lot of cross work between analytic and continental debates, and between philosophy of religion and political philosophy. So always trying to figure, who are the people not reading the debate to which I'm contributing? How do I expand that debate to invite more readers? And then a few years ago, I started getting invitations to speak at companies and at corporate events. And I recognized, wow, as the universities continue to slide more toward a corporate model of doing business, which breaks my heart and I think is a disaster for higher education, the university administration rarely listens to the faculty saying, hey, this is a bad idea. But what if we got in front of the CEOs and started helping them rethink what it is that they want from universities? And maybe this would be a kind of subversive way to have the sort of impact that I wish we were having at our own institutions. And so that kind of opened my eyes to recognizing there's bigger spaces to do the kind of work we do, and the value proposition that we offer as philosophers is something that no one will see unless we make that proposition accessible to them. And it's really been exciting to see the way philosophy can be transformative. And we've always said this to our students, right? Take philosophy, it'll change your lives. But for some reason, we haven't then invited the rest of the world to be changed in similar ways. And I think that's maybe an increasing need as we move into times where the humanities become less and less perceived as valuable. We've just got to change that value proposition. So.
Right. And one of the things that I've found, I don't know if you found it as well, Aaron, is that there is a passion for philosophy in the public realm. Right? You have The Good Place, which became wildly popular. The New York Times has its Stone column that gets read pretty regularly. There are podcasts in philosophy. And what I found is that if you make philosophy accessible to people, they get interested. They want to engage. And I think, Aaron, it's also the time that we live in. I mean, wider than just the coronavirus itself, is that we live in this neoliberal period where people are encouraged to be on their own, to be entrepreneurs of themselves, not to think in terms of social solidarity, not to think in terms of the social relationships. And I think people feel alone and lonely, and they want some sense of meaning and connection. And philosophy can offer that, and in a reflective way, both by the content of allowing people to think about their lives, but also in the kind of networks it creates of discussion with one another and community.
I think that's right. And one of the things that I have actually found most compelling about philosophy myself is that, unlike most other disciplines and fields, almost everyone has a view about the kinds of questions we ask.
Yeah.
So, I have no idea what my own view is about the workings of a protein strain when affected by a particular acid or something. And yet, I, prior to studying philosophy, still had views on God and meaning and value and moral life and justice. And so philosophy, I think in particular, invites a broader populace to think about what they already think about. And that's something that is really, really compelling.
Yeah, and the way I conceive philosophy, at least my work in philosophy, is that what it does is it offers just more rigorous forms of reflection. And people do want to reflect on their lives. And if we can help them reflect in a more rigorous way, based on the kind of training we've had and the kinds of experiences that we undergo, then I think that's helpful for folks.
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the areas of reflection that I think is going on a lot right now in these very strange times in which we find ourselves is an awareness of our vulnerability, an awareness of that going out of our houses could lead to one's own sickness, to the sickness of a loved one, to the death of strangers you've never even met because of the way the virus works. And in a book that I have my class read quite often, Your Fragile Life, you defend the importance of embracing vulnerability as a way of finding meaning in life because we're not immortal. Maybe you could say something about how embracing vulnerability is a way of providing a kind of hope for people where we find ourselves today.
The idea is this, that there are a number of philosophies that counsel some sort of invulnerability, that somehow we can overcome our suffering, we can make ourselves immune to it in one way or another. And what I've always thought is that, well, there's something attractive about that. It's not something that I think I or most people that I'm aware of would want to embrace. In other words, we don't want to be creatures that when something terrible happens, we are somehow above and beyond grieving or suffering. So it's not so much that we seek to embrace the suffering, the vulnerability itself, right? But rather that for most of us, I think what caring requires is an openness to that. That for me, to care about someone means that if something bad happens to them, I'm going to grieve. I'm going to suffer. And if something bad happened to them and I didn't suffer or didn't grieve, then I would wonder how much I actually cared about them. So I think that there's that. It's not that we want to suffer, but rather that suffering, the openness to suffering, is tied up with our notion of what caring is. Now, I want to be a little careful here, Aaron, and I want to say something about the virus. I want to be a little bit careful about this because I don't want to say, right, that people who have embraced, say, a fully Buddhist or Stoic perspective and feel themselves beyond suffering, I don't want to say that they don't care about other folks, right? They may very well care about other folks. What I'm saying is that for most of us, that caring involves the openness to grieving and involves that vulnerability, right? The virus, as you've said, has brought out that vulnerability in important ways because, right, we often go through our lives not really thinking about our vulnerability in terms of what other people do, in terms of relationships we might have, in terms of particularly just our everyday behavior. And what the virus has brought out is that we are vulnerable to other people, often in our everyday behavior. And I think there's more, which is that although the virus has brought it out so that it's easier to see, I think it's always there. So when I say, when I do something that's going to contribute to the climate crisis, right, I'm affecting people. When I buy an item that's made by exploited laborers, I'm affecting people. Right? We do many, and by the way, this can go in a positive direction as well, right? I can do things that will help people self-consciously. So I think much of our everyday behavior does affect others, and we're affected by what they do. What the virus has brought out for us is to see this in a particular case more clearly than we might have otherwise seen it.
That general awareness that seeing things in ways we might otherwise have missed is one of the things that philosophy has always been about. I say often that philosophers take seriously what most everybody else takes for granted. And I think that in moments where something that we take for granted breaks, as Martin Heidegger would suggest, when you're using the hammer and the hammer snaps, you're aware of the fact that this tool is a bad tool. But while you're using the hammer, sometimes you almost forget that you even got it in your hand, which is why we hit our fingers often. So we've got this sort of broken hammer of a world right now where we're having to interrogate our normal modes of operation. In your book on death, you talk a lot about the way in which this general sense of unease and dread, you refer to this both, I think, in Death and Fragile Life, about the queen of darkness, this temptation towards depression and being overwhelmed by the brokenness rather than seeing the opportunity for innovation and response. How is it that you think philosophy might actually be a kind of salve or a kind of solace given this intense global anxiety that we, I think, all feel now in a sort of solidarity way?
I think there's a few roles that philosophy can play. And again, Aaron, I'm going to state them and then I'm going to toss it back to you because I know you've thought about this as well. Right? But one of them is to take a slightly longer view. There's a lot of panic out there, not simply about what's going on, but about what it might mean for our world. You hear a lot of phrases of the sort, things will never be the same. And the fact is that we're caught up in this moment. We don't know what things are going to be like. And because philosophy can give us the reflective space to take a longer view, that I think can be helpful. If for no other reason, then rather than panic about the far future, we can just admit that there are things that we don't know, and that we will try to confront as they arise. Right? But the second, and I think related thing, is this: that philosophy as a practice of ethics can get us to step back and ask ourselves, what can we do in this situation, right? If we step back from that initial panic about the world never being the same and recognize that we find ourselves in this moment, then one of the questions we can ask ourselves is, well, what kinds of effects do I have on the world? And how can I have better ones than the ones that I've had? And that involves some reflection, right? Philosophy can provide some tools, right? But people can do this sometimes without the formal tools of philosophy. So I think both in stepping back and getting perspective on the one hand, and then in ourselves within that stepping back, what kinds of ethical modes of behavior we might engage in. Philosophy, I think, allows us or opens up the possibility of doing both of those, right? That's not to say that you need formal philosophy to do it, but it is to say that formal philosophy can provide help in doing those very human activities. But I'm curious, because I know you've reflected on this as well, what you might see here.
One of the things I find most compelling about philosophy is the way that it allows us often to ask questions behind questions, or to ask, well, what's motivating a particular sense or a particular statement? For example, I often get asked, how could you still believe in God and be a postmodernist? Or how can you be a Christian and be a philosopher? These sorts of questions that are confusing to a lot of people who don't understand, what it is we do as professionals. And my response never is, oh, well, here's how, here's why. My response always is to say, well, what sort of God do you think I believe in? Let's actually figure out why you see a tension here in order to unpack that tension. And it turns out almost always the God they present me with, I say, oh, well, it turns out I don't believe in that God, so I guess there's no problem. And in the same sort of way where we find ourselves now, when we ask or worry that the world will never be the same, part of me then wants to kick into the questions of, well, what is it that we would lament about it changing? Or what is it that's so problematic about the world never being the same? And you and I both can imagine millions of global neighbors who hope the world is never the same as it was before. Maybe this creates a new heightened awareness for the need for healthcare being accessible and affordable. Maybe this changes the way we understand certain access points to social relationships. Maybe this changes the way we understand unemployment benefits and sick days and the way that we all share each other's burdens. So I think what philosophy can do is sometimes, you described the long view, which I think is exactly right. Another way to say it is it can let us have a pause button in the assumptions about life. And that pause button doesn't mean that we then immediately adopt a different view, but it allows us the ability to interrogate the views we already have and just inquire, maybe there's a better way to see something or a better way to understand something. As David Foster Wallace says, when we become aware of our default settings about the world, it gives us the opportunity to reflect on whether they should continue to be the settings by which we operate. And I think philosophy is not uniquely, but distinctively suited to that kind of pausing work. And right now, where we're all, isolated and our lives seem oddly slow right now, I kind of figure that people in New York are getting a taste of what they think living in the South always is like, where we just aren't out doing and doing and doing. And yet, for me, the thought is, as a lifelong Southerner, there's something right about a little bit of slowness, a little bit of intentional reflection on how am I going to go about this day? What am I going to do that makes meaning within it? Instead of simply finding ourselves navigating, the world according to whatever our phone is beeping, telling us is our next appointment and next meeting. And so I think there's an opportunity there not to see it as a disaster, but an opportunity for thinking differently about how we might go forward from here.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you talk about the pause button and the questions that you raised, Aaron, in terms of healthcare and our relationships and what we might owe and how we might think in terms of rearranging the world so that it's better for folks than the world that we currently live in, they're all ethical questions. And I think one of the things that is worth focusing on is getting people or encouraging people or even allowing people who move that way to think ethically, because there is another less helpful way that people might move, which is say, look, this virus showed how vulnerable I am. What I'm going to have to do is shore myself up, right? And put barriers around me so that I'm safer, right? Even if that's not helpful for other folks. And unfortunately, right, we have a presidential administration that exemplifies that. It says it's all about me. It's all about what I can get. And I think we need to push back against that, against the self-serving moves that might be made in a crisis like this, and toward the ethical ones. And we see, of course, any number of ethical actions being taken by folks, people contributing to organizations that help healthcare workers and help the unemployed, people trying to produce items that will, that hospital workers can use, people buying gift certificates from restaurants that, that otherwise would not be liquid. I think we see a lot of that. And if we can reflectively ask ourselves about the world we would like to see in the wake of this, then I think we can open toward a more ethical turn that would counter, right, some of the self-servingness that we see in the administration, and that in a neoliberal world we're encouraged to think in terms of. Right, that's, I think, something the pause button can do for us, if we avoid the danger of where that pause button might lead us.
Yeah, it certainly is the case that a kind of fear can create a tendency towards self-protection.
Yeah.
And your work, thinking in particular about, the new work in A Decent Life and also the work in A Significant Life, where you describe these important interconnections and relationships as related to the idea of what you call the grounding projects of human existence, right? What it is that we hope for defines how we then take ourselves up in significant ways. How is it that you think we can maybe cultivate practices of shared hope in times like this?
Yeah, I think in general, the way we become who we are behaviorally is rooted in habituation. Of course, this goes all the way back to the philosopher Aristotle, right? Mm-hmm. How do we become virtuous? We become virtuous by habituating ourselves, by daily doing the exercises, right, that would help us become a certain way. So I think on the one hand, that by simply behaving in ways that we would like to see ourselves behave, right, we become habituated. But I think that there's more to it as well, which is there, and psychological studies have shown this, there's something that's really rewarding to people who are helping other people. So it's, and the way I put it, it's not just a matter of getting paid back, but watching it get paid forward. So as an everyday example, if you're driving and somebody wants to pull into traffic and you let them into you let them in, right? And there's somebody else that pulls behind, the person behind you is much more likely to let that person in, because they see it as a model. So I think that on the one hand, habituating ourselves to action, and on the other hand, taking up the rewards of seeing what effects our actions have, right, both on people directly and in encouraging paying it forward, right, can lead us toward a space where at least parts of our ethical behavior, right, are not simply thought of as burdens to be borne, right, by sacrificing our own interests, but as something that we can find rewarding in itself, right? Look, some of the burdens that we have to take up ethically or morally are going to simply be burdens. Mm-hmm. But I think that there is a way of moving through life to see much of our moral behavior, not in terms of burdens, but in terms of what I could call a certain moral gracefulness. Yeah. And if we can embrace that moral gracefulness in our actions by habituating ourselves and in seeing what effects those actions have, I think that will help us, right, to move forward in the ways that we like to after this pause we find ourselves in, right? And we can do it now, right? I mean, buying gift certificates, using takeout food from local places, contributing a little money, seeing if there's somebody who's elderly in the neighborhood who could use a call. There are people who are being laid off, say, at universities. Finding out who they are, maybe taking up, doing a GoFundMe for them, right? There are ways in which we can do this, all of which will be gratifying and all of which will orient us moving forward in a more ethical direction.
One of the things that strikes me about what you've just described is the way that thinking this through, we hope, would become almost obvious, that it would become intrinsically sensible, that caring about one's neighbor is the highest mode of caring about oneself, that these are not mutually exclusive. And in fact, part of the idea of social distancing is I need other people to act in responsible ways for my concern for my own loved ones to be actualized, right?
Yes.
This isn't somehow like we are constantly competing for scarce resources. It's that we're invested in how to make the world a space where both of us are able to thrive and flourish. But sometimes, as you know quite well, given your work as an activist, there have to be decisions that are really, really hard that are made in the name of ethics as well. We see this right now in Italy, where decisions about, who gets ventilators and who lives, it's almost like the trolley car problem has become, displayed in gritty detail in horrifying ways in front of us. Philosophers often tend to think about these things in abstracted ways. And yet one of the things that we're seeing right now is on the ground in front of us, abstraction runs into walls of human need. And so what do you say for those doctors on the front lines, the politicians making decisions about scarce resources? How is it that we sometimes then can use moral decision making to navigate places that aren't so clear, that aren't, shared and joyful if we just get together, but might actually lead to a kind of suffering and a kind of outcome that is necessarily suboptimal? What do you say to them?
Well, I think the first thing that is for us as philosophers to say to ourselves, there's a limit to the kinds of guts we can give. I don't know much about the kinds of issues that doctors have to face in terms of how they might triage, right? I don't know economically where sometimes the best resources are to go. So I think this is a place where there's overlap, right, between the philosophy and other forms of expertise. And philosophers have to understand that there are things that we might be helpful with, but there's also plenty we don't know and plenty we would need to know to give particular practical advice, right? I mean, there are tools that philosophy has ethically. There are thinkings in terms of utility and causing better consequences and the overall good versus what has to be sacrificed. On the one hand, there are issues of respect. On the other hand, respect for each individual and the recognition, right, that even if that you can't help that individual, that's still a person worthy of respect. Right? I've had conversations with an oncologist about people who are dying and what to do if you can't help them, ways you can still respect them. So in terms of reminders about respect, thinking in terms of overall utility, right, thinking in terms of social cooperation, all of these, I think, are elements that lend a philosophical flair. But that philosophical flair is, as you say, it's too abstracted if it's simply applied to the situation, right? These various situations.
Yeah, maybe a way to say this is one thing that philosophers also take really seriously, and it's something that I wish our politicians had taken more seriously on the front end of this catastrophe of this pandemic, is the relevance of epistemic authority. Mm-hmm. That part of knowing what you know is knowing very clearly what you do not. and then where to find people who do. And that appropriate humility is what allows us to make better decisions about where appropriate actions are required. And so one of the things I've been surprised by recently is the number of people who think that because, let's say, they hold beliefs about one domain, this then licenses them to be experts in all domains. And philosophers, when we do our job correctly, should be, I think, models of what it looks like to say, you know what, I have some ideas about maybe how to frame this question or about some values that should be deployed,
Yeah.
but I'm going to have to let different kinds of expertise sound different here. And I do think that this is something that, in particular, the way you have thought for a long time about a kind of anarchist social policy, which I don't take to be, you know, disband the government, but a kind of destabilizing of the idea that one would know all, that it's a kind of invitation for a radically plural democratic project of being able to help each other fill in the various gaps that define the human condition. Is that how you understand a sort of anarchist response to where we find ourselves, or would you see it quite differently?
Let me step back, say something about philosophy, all right, and then swing back forward into anarchism, right? Because philosophy, at one time and for many centuries, right, thought of itself as foundationalist. That is to say, it was going to offer the basic foundations upon which all of the other sciences were going to be built, right? Now that's an illusion I think that philosophers no longer embrace. Although you know as well as I do, Aaron, that there are philosophers who still, let's say, have that as their personal ethos.
That's right.
If I could put it that way, right? But once you abandon that, then you realize that philosophy is one among many different ways of thinking about and approaching the world. And there are various forms of expertise, of which philosophy is simply one among them, right? Now, that's already, I want to say, thinking in an anarchist way about the role of philosophy, right? That what seems to be fundamental to anarchism is treating other people as equally important, right? As individuals equally worthy of some basic form of human respect. And that doesn't mean we all have the same expertise. In fact, what it means is that I may not have expertise that someone else does. And so if we take one another, right, as equally worthy of respect and try to orient ourselves that way, then we will often have a sort of a bottom-up view versus a top-down view, right? And one of the problems with the current administration relative to this virus, but other things as well, is that there is a sort of top-down view. We know what's best. Right? Before the break, when it was clear what was going to happen in terms of folks not coming back, I was telling students, I said, look, I said, Trump doesn't know what he's doing. And that by itself is not a problem, right? Nobody elected Trump or nobody voted for Hillary Clinton because they'd be really good at disease control, right? This wasn't what people were after. The problem is not that he doesn't know what he's doing, but that he thinks he does. And that's when you're refusing to defer to people who have expertise, right? And seeing yourself in a hierarchical relationship to others rather than the more egalitarian relationship that an anarchist kind of perspective would foster.
Yeah, and maybe this brings us full circle as a way of coming to maybe a final question for you. It seems to me that one of the reasons to be a public philosopher is because when we are doing what we do in public, we're modeling what it looks like to be an expert who is very well attuned to needing other experts to answer the questions that we are very good at asking, instead of simply saying, oh, you need us to answer these questions. It might be the case that no, you need philosophers in order to raise the questions that too often are being overlooked. So maybe a way to invite our listeners to go forward over the next days and weeks in this situation, what are the questions that you're hoping that our leaders are asking, that the everyday neighbors, behind their doors in their houses are asking? What are the questions that you would hope to cultivate for them as we navigate this together?
Well, I mean, I would think some of the questions would be fairly straightforward, Aaron, which would be uh, initially the questions of what's going to be best for folks. But then more deeply, how should we think about what's going to be best for folks? And that's where some philosophical tools can come in. Eventually, of course, we have to think about the question, how do we get here? I think that that's a question that probably shouldn't be front-loaded, but is one that we're going to have to come back to. And that's going to involve ethical considerations, because it's going to involve questions of ethical failure. Right? But the other thing I want to say, in response to the first part of what you said in terms of helping people and modeling for people, is another thing that, at least for me personally, has been gratifying about doing public intellectual work among various populations. I mean, most of the folks I speak to come from areas very different from philosophy. And this has been great for me because I meet interesting people, right? I meet people with these other forms of expertise, right? So not only, right, do I get to model what a certain epistemic humility might involve, right? I actually get to learn, right, what some of these other people with expertise have to tell me. And that way I become a student learner. And what could be better, right, than going through your life, right, being a student learner?
There is a debate that has emerged over the past few decades between, philosophers and physicists, where some physicists have argued that philosophers have become useless because we're still asking questions that haven't been answered for several thousand years, whereas physics is able to ask questions and then, through mathematics, get to the answer and make progress. And so the charge is that philosophers don't ever make any progress. But your answer makes me double down on the idea that if we can answer questions quickly, they're probably not the questions that affect the heart of the human condition. That these questions that take several thousand years just to even get a sense of why the question is a question, there's something about that slowness, to go back to your idea of a long view. There's something about the pause button that lets us say, wow, those questions that we haven't answered, what is justice? Well, there's lots of options on how to approach this and how to answer it. What's the right thing to do? What is the good life? You have written books that have articulated your approach to that. I've written books articulating my approach to it. And yet when we get together, the fun is recognizing, oh, shoot, there's something I still haven't thought through. Give me more time and we'll keep thinking together. And so it is always a joy to think with you, and you inspire me to recognize that philosophy is never a spectator sport, but it's something that invites us to get our hands messy, not just with difficult problems, but with also difficult solutions. So thank you so much, Todd, for being with us today.
Well, look, it's been great to sort of be down in the mud of philosophy with you.
No, well, it's wonderful. Thank you again.
All right, take care.